Hello and welcome to another episode of CityCast. I think it's our fourth episode on CityCast, and today we are getting to a unique passage of scripture in 1 Timothy 3. We're going to deal with women deacons. Should there be women deacons? Should there not be women deacons? And so if you want to look at the passage with me, I'm going to read to you 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13. This is Paul's explanation to Timothy on the offices of elder before this passage and then deacon. And he says this: deacons likewise must be dignified, likewise comparing it to the elder, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. But then look at verse 11, and this is kind of where we're going to camp out for this podcast. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, not sober-minded, faithful in all things. Then it goes back to kind of talking about the men. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Okay, so that's the passage. That's what we're going to wrestle with for just a few moments here. Is this passage talking about the wives of the male deacons, as ESV and other translations has translated it, where it says their wives, or should it say women? Now, the difficulty in this passage is the Greek word is diakonos, which is just the word for woman, women. There is no Greek word for wives, and then this the word there that they've placed in there to associate it with the actual male deacons' wives, their wives. That word is not in the Greek either. It just says diakonos, which is women, and so we're left to kind of interpret. What does that mean? Is he talking to the wives of the deacons, or is he talking to an office of women deacons or deaconesses? And so we're going to focus on verse 11 for just a moment. And it's an important issue because some churches, good brothers, good churches, fall on both sides of this issue. Some say, no, the deacon office as well as the elder office is reserved for men. Some would say that the women can fulfill this office of deacon. And so, again, good brothers and sisters on both sides, this is not something necessarily worth splitting over. Obviously not a first-tier issue, as long as the deacon role is held in the biblical sense, meaning it's not a deacon that has authority. It's not as you know. It's a diakon. It's a diakonos role, which is a servant role, meaning it's not teaching. The role is not having authority within the church. Then I think it can be safe to assume that whether you fall on the side of women can or cannot fulfill that role, you can, obviously worship alongside those who hold either a value there. And so a couple quick bullet points on both sides of the argument, and then I'll kind of tell you where I stand. But first, let's deal with those who believe that the word says their wives. And one of the arguments is that verse 11 seems like a very weird place to interject a new office or a new role. And then in verse 12 to go back to talking about male deacons. And so the argument is, if this was talking about women deacons, why didn't the passage continue to talk about women deacons instead of going back to the male deacons? But this is not a very convincing argument for a couple of reasons. But one is you still have to deal with the fact that Paul interrupts the argument regardless, whether he's talking about women or women deacons, or whether he's talking about the wives of the deacons. He still interrupts the passage with verse 11, and then he goes back to talking about men. So both are kind of very unique and kind of out of the ordinary of typical language. And so anyway, that's one of the arguments. That's kind of a weird placement for that. Another argument is that if you equate Acts 6 as the establishment of the first deacons, then the argument goes as follows, that those were all men. Now, I would push back on that a bit again and just say that I'm not a big proponent of saying that those were the first deacons, primarily because they weren't called deacons. Now they did serve under the elders. They did some deaconing things. They took some things off of the apostles so that the apostles could be focused on the preaching of the word and prayer. And so they did some deaconing things, but they also did some things that were beyond the deacon role. Stephen preaching, supernatural works, some different things that they were accomplishing that were beyond that role. And so it leaves a little bit of speculation as to what were they in fact. And it's not clear. They're not certainly not called deacons. They're not given that office. So it's kind of assumed that they were the first ones in that role. And if that's the case, then it's also assumed that the apostles essentially fulfilled the first elder role, but the apostles kind of had their own roles. And so it's a little bit convoluted there. The third argument in that is that the office of deacon in a lot of churches has been given the responsibility of teaching or authority within the church. And so people don't want to incorporate women into that position because it would violate Paul's command that a woman shouldn't teach or have authority over a man. I would say that that's a displacement of the role of deacon, right? So the role of deacon is different than the role of elder, frankly, because of those two things, that they teach and have authority within the church. And so because those things are stripped from the deacon role, they're exclusively for the elder role, then the deacon role should be a role of service within the body, an office of service within the body, and coming under the under shepherds, the elders, and the overseers, coming under their authority in order to serve the body and serve the elders. Now, again, there's great brothers and sisters that hold to that. And then there's the other side, and great brothers and sisters hold to this. I mentioned in my sermon this past Sunday, brothers like John MacArthur, even John Calvin held to this, had deaconesses. So here's some bullet points for that argument. The first point is that the word likewise begins the section on deacons. Likewise, deacons, referring to likewise, the deacons should have qualifications as the elders did. So it kind of indicated a new category. Well, that happens again when Paul starts talking about women. He says, like women likewise. And so it would go to reason that maybe he's creating another category here when he's talking about women, particularly that category being deaconesses, women deacons. And so that's one argument. The second argument would be that it would be odd to include a section about the qualifications of the deacon's wife and yet to exclude the qualifications of an elder's wife. And so, if we're talking about role in ministry, it would seem to factor in that the elder's wife would be more in the spotlight, so to speak, than a deacon's wife. And so to leave out the qualifications of an elder's wife, but to require qualifications of a deacon's wife just seems odd, seems out of place. And so it would stand to reason that it's not talking about their wives, but in fact, talking about an office. And that kind of clears up the whole thing, that Paul goes from elders to male deacons to female deacons and deaconesses. And so that's an argument there. Another argument is that the qualifications given to the women are synonymous with some of the qualifications given to deacons and elders, that they're called to be dignified and different things within their role that would match up to the qualifications that were also given to the male deacons. And so to repeat those to the women would also indicate that it's referring to an office. Another point is that deaconing, as I've already mentioned, as the Bible teaches it, is not a teaching position or position of authority. Those are exclusively reserved for men in the elder position. And therefore, the deacon role as it stands in the Bible would not prohibit a woman from being able to serve in that capacity because it's a serving capacity. Another argument is Phoebe in Romans 16:1, that Phoebe is arguably a deaconess. Again, it lacks clarity, like specifically because the deacon, diakonos can stand, it just means servant. And so the interpretation of that word servant, whether it means office or just serving, is always kind of the role of the interpreter. And so, but Phoebe could have been a deacon type of role. Certainly in the early church, you had women serving, caring for sick believers, serving the poor, serving strangers, ministering to those in prison. And they in Titus, you see they're teaching women and children in Titus 2:3-5. In addition to this, Phoebe likely carried the letter of Romans to the Roman church, which would fit a deaconess type of role. And so she serves the church, serves Paul by taking the letter to the Romans. So these are kind of the arguments on both sides. Again, great brothers and sisters on both sides of the argument. And, whatever you hold to, we can have fellowship with one another. I don't think it's a big issue, but where I stand on the issue, I think the argument leans towards allowing for deaconesses, women deacons. And so I'm of that opinion that women can serve in that office, in that position. And again, this is not a position of teaching or authority. It's simply a woman being able to use her gifts in the church in a capacity where those serving gifts are acknowledged and treasured within the body. And now, obviously, you don't have to be a deacon to serve. You don't have to be a deacon to do many things within the church. Matter of fact, most people who do stuff in the church are not, in fact, deacons. But to step in that role, to be able to serve, is a role that I think can be a man or a woman. And so that's where I stand. I hope this is helpful to you. Just going back and forth on the arguments and kind of trying to clear up maybe something that's a little bit muddy. If you've got comments or questions, please put them in the comment section here, and we'll try to deal with them. But otherwise, man, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next week.